When I was in university, long before I ever decided to study for the ministry, I took a course in the religious studies department called Sacred Space. It was based on the idea that as human beings, we imagine that there are some spaces which are set apart and special, spaces which are sacred or holy. Muslims, for example, have Mecca. Muslims, if they can, will make a pilgrimage to Mecca at some point in their lives. Muslims in their daily prayer will turn and face Mecca, because Mecca is a sacred space in their faith. It's a different kind of space. It is unlike all other places. Roman Catholics have the altar. In the sanctuary, there is the altar, which is a table, and it's where the priest performs the Mass and re-effects the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. That special sacrament is something which happens over the altar. And so the altar and the space directly above it is a sacred space, a place which is set apart, a place which is unlike all other places. For some Protestant Christians, the altar has been replaced by the pulpit as a sacred space. There's a Protestant church I know of, not too far away from here, where the communion table is sort of tucked out of the way, pushed out of the way so that it doesn't get in the way of people moving and so on. And it's brought out only 4 or 5 times a year. But at the front of that church is a grand pulpit to which the attention of the eye is drawn. And there's room behind the pulpit for only one person. And the sacred space in that worldview is the small space where the minister stands to give the Word of God. For Quakers, the sacred space is the meeting house, where the friends will sit round in a square or in a circle, looking at one another, waiting for the inspiration to speak. We as human beings imagine that there are some special, set apart, sacred places which are unlike all other regular spaces. Anne read so beautifully and clearly for us a few minutes ago from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 17. And the story about Jesus and his 3 close disciples, which we heard, invites us to imagine and reflect on the idea of what space God invites us to consider as sacred and set apart. The story begins with Jesus withdrawing from the group of his 12 disciples and those many others who followed him round, with the 3 who formed his inner circle, the executive committee of the disciples, Peter and James and John. And the gospel writer tells us that Jesus led them up a high mountain. And in the language and the worldview of Jesus' day, a high mountain is something which clues us into the idea that this is to be a sacred place where God will be met. Commentators and scholars have debated amongst one another which mountain in Palestine was this? Which mountain did they go up? Can we go up that same mountain today? And I've no doubt that perhaps we could go up the same mountain, except that I think the gospel writer wants us to realize that it doesn't particularly matter which mountain they did go up, or we would have been told. High mountains, high places were places of a potential encounter with God. And when Jesus got to the top of the mountain with the three disciples, all of a sudden they saw that he was transformed before their eyes. He began to shine like the sun. His face had a remarkable radiance. His clothes became a dazzling white. And we can well imagine those three disciples having to sort of half turn away and perhaps shield their eyes from the brilliance of Jesus before them. And then perhaps out of the corner of their eyes, seen at their sideways glance, the disciples saw Jesus in conversation with Moses and Elijah. Great heroes of the faith. Arguably the two greatest prophets of ancient Israel. Gone for centuries. How can this be? Many commentators have remarked that this is a story, though recorded not only in Matthew, but in some of the other New Testament Gospels, that it is a very unique story, unlike any other recorded in the New Testament. I think what the Gospel writer wants to point us to is that this place at the top of this high mountain has become, for that time, the meeting place of heaven and of earth. This is why Jesus is transformed. This is why he is shining brightly. This is likely why the disciples would have had to hide their eyes. This is why Jesus is able to converse with great prophets of the faith. This has become the meeting point of heaven and of earth. Incidentally, I think that this makes this particular story not unique, not unlike other stories found about Jesus in the New Testament Gospels, but just like every other story about him. See, I believe that when the Gospel writers tell a story about Jesus healing someone who was sick, giving sight to someone who was blind, calling someone who was lame to get up and walk, teaching about the kingdom of God that allows people to hear the good news. These are all things that happen because in and around the person of Jesus, we find that heaven and earth come into the closest of contacts. And Peter said to Jesus, well, this is good that we're here to see what a holy place this is. How about I build 3 tents? One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And I think what Peter was doing and offering to build these tents was to lay at that spot a marker so that they could remember this is a meeting place of heaven and earth. We can leave and then another time come back and we'll remember where this special place was. We can tell others and they can come and they will know where this special place is, and we can worship once again at this meeting place of heaven and earth. See, the Jews of Jesus' day and of antiquity built markers at such holy places. Much like in our day, we put up a historical plaque to say that a famous person was born or lived or worked here at this spot. Some of you may recall the story of Jacob in the Old Testament in the book of Genesis. After he had slept in the wilderness with his head on a rock and had a dream of angels descending and ascending into heaven, he woke up and he said, "Surely this is the gate of heaven." And he built there an altar that he might remember where was this meeting place of heaven and earth. Then, unexpectedly, the gospel writer records that a cloud sort of thing came down round the disciples, and they heard a voice. "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." You may recall that these are almost exactly the words that were spoken after Jesus came back up out of the Jordan River following his baptism by John. "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." And do you remember what happened just after Jesus came up out of the waters and just before those words were spoken? Heaven opened, as it is opened here, as this has become the meeting place of heaven and earth. And having heard these heavenly words from God, the three disciples fell flat on their faces, and they worshiped. They were struck dumb with awe at the majesty of God who has come into their midst, and deemed them worthy to receive a word. I find it interesting to reflect how in just a short space of time the worship practice of these three disciples has evolved. A few moments ago, they were wanting to put up a little monument as a reminder of what had happened at this place. Now they are on their faces before the majesty of God. I have many friends among the clergy, people I get together with to have a coffee with or to talk shop. I have very few among the clergy whom I look to as spiritual mentors. There's one in particular whom I will call or ask for a chat with when I'm going through something difficult, when I really need to just share and seek some wisdom from a a godly and a mature follower of Jesus. One in particular I found out after we'd become friends and after he'd already become my mentor, that he goes into his church an hour or an hour and a half before anyone else will arrive. And he spends that time on his face in prayer. No wonder he struck me as someone that I ought to learn from, someone whose counsel I ought to seek. He knows what it is to worship God. He knows what it is to come into the presence of God. There's no one I know who is more attuned to what God is saying, who has heard more from God. Because in humility, he seeks to come into the presence of God, to humble and to silence himself before God, to give God praise. Jesus then came over to the three disciples lying flat on the ground, and he crouched down and he took them by the arm and he invited them to stand. And when they stood, the gospel writer says that they saw Jesus alone. Not Moses, not Elijah, not some blinding light, but Jesus alone. And in this space of time, however long it has been, things have come full circle. And at this high place, this holy place, they are with Jesus. One of my previous ministries was in a small country church. And one of the things I did when I was a minister of that congregation was led a midweek Bible study. I can't remember what day of the week it was, but it was in the morning. And it was mostly women that came, mostly of retirement age, but that doesn't matter. We started to meet at the church building at first, but then one of the participants had to give up her driver's license, and so we started meeting in her home. And so we would just all gather there, and I remember she always would invite me to sit in the most comfortable reclining chair in her living room. And I found it a little bit actually difficult to try and teach and lead this Bible study with my feet up and being so comfortable, and yet that was how I was invited to be. And for this Bible study, we worked through the Gospel of John from beginning to end. The Gospel of John, if you've never read it through, is rich and wonderful. It cannot be skimmed over. It can be dug into and explored and poked and prodded. And one can never come to the ends of its insight. I remember feeling at times frustrated for weeks on end when the participants of my Bible study, though they had been faithful church members for their entire lives, decades, did not seem as thrilled as I would by the wonders of John's gospel. I will never forget, however, as we read through the 11th chapter, which, as you recall, may recount the story of the raising of Lazarus. And the gospel writer shows us how the raising of Lazarus and later the resurrection of Jesus was fit and woven so beautifully into the hope of Israel and the promise of God. And somehow, in a way that I can't explain, I saw scales literally fall from the eyes of these women. It is as though their countenance changed. It is as though their faces began to glow. Their spiritual lives, their faith came alive. There in that old farmhouse, in the middle of a field, on a windswept country road, in the middle of nowhere, God arrived. And that place became a meeting of heaven and of earth. God has created all that there is, the entire world. Anywhere and everywhere can become a sacred, holy, set apart, special place which is unlike any other places. Wherever and whenever that may be, there will be a group of people who see Jesus and perceive him for who he is, God's beloved Son. Praise be to God. Amen.